The rain fell in persistent sheets over London, as if the heavens themselves wept for Lady Clara Whitmore's fate. She stood before the looking-glass, a portrait of silent resignation, her wedding gown cascading around her like frozen sea foam. The ceremony had been brief, perfunctory, a business transaction disguised as matrimony. The Whitmore estate saved from ruin, the Duke of Ravenshade securing a bride of suitable lineage. Not a single word of love had been uttered throughout the proceedings. "My lady," her maid whispered, "the carriage awaits." Clara nodded, unable to form words. The weight of expectation pressed upon her chest, making each breath shallow and painful. She had known this day would come, that she would be bartered away to secure her family's position. What she had not anticipated was the visceral terror that now gripped her very being. "You look beautiful," the maid offered, adjusting the veil with trembling fingers. "His Grace will surely be pleased." Clara closed her eyes, willing herself to disappear. The rustling of her gown sounded thunderous in her ears as she descended the grand staircase for the final time as Lady Whitmore. The family portrait gallery bore silent witness to her passage. Generations of women who had endured the same fate, their painted eyes following her with ancestral sympathy. Outside, the Duke's carriage loomed, black and imposing against the grey London sky. The footman opened the door with practiced efficiency, and Clara caught her first glimpse of the man who was now her husband. The Duke of Ravenshade sat motionless, a figure carved from marble, his eyes impenetrable beneath the brim of his hat. He did not rise, did not offer his hand, merely inclined his head in acknowledgement of her presence. "Lady Ravenshade," he said, the title falling between them like a dropped glove. The carriage lurched forward through the rain-slicked streets. Clara pressed herself against the opposite seat, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles blanched white. Each cobblestone jolted through her body, marking the diminishing distance between her past life and the uncertain future that awaited. "I trust the ceremony was to your satisfaction," the Duke remarked, his voice as distant as the thunder rolling across the horizon. "Yes, Your Grace," Clara responded, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. "Edmund," he corrected, though his tone lacked warmth. "We are husband and wife now. Formalities seem rather pointless between us. Husband and wife." The words echoed in Clara's mind, like foreign syllables from a language she had never learned to speak. She stole a glance at his profile, the severe line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, a man accustomed to command, to obedience. The carriage turned onto a tree-lined avenue, and Clara glimpsed Ravenshade House for the first time, a vast Georgian mansion, its windows like watchful eyes peering through the rain. Her prison, her home. "We shall arrive momentarily," the Duke, Edmund, observed. "My mother awaits our return. She is eager to make your acquaintance." Clara felt her stomach twist. Another scrutinizing gaze to endure, another person to disappoint. "I shall endeavor to please her, your Edmund." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "My mother has never been pleased a day in her life, Lady Ravenshade. I would not concern yourself with attempting the impossible." The carriage halted before a sweeping marble staircase. A line of servants stood in perfect formation despite the downpour, their faces betraying nothing. At their head stood an austere woman in midnight blue, her silver hair arranged in an immaculate coronet. "The Duchess Dowager," Edmund murmured. "Steel yourself." Before Clara could respond, the carriage door swung open. Edmund descended first, then turned to offer his hand. Clara hesitated, then placed her gloved fingers upon his. His grip was firm, but not crushing, guiding her into the rain and toward her new life. "Mother," Edmund addressed the silver-haired woman, "may I present my wife, Lady Clara Ravenshade?" The Duchess Dowager's gaze swept over Clara like a winter wind, assessing and cataloguing every perceived deficiency. "So this is the Whitmore girl. Rather slight, isn't she? I do hope she proves hardier than she appears." Clara felt her cheeks burn despite the chill. The shame of being discussed as though she were livestock was almost unbearable. "She has endured the ceremony and the journey without complaint," Edmund replied. "I believe that demonstrates sufficient fortitude." The old woman's mouth thinned. "We shall see. Come inside before you both catch your death. There is tea in the drawing-room." As they passed through the grand entrance hall, Clara felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. Portraits of stern-faced Ravenshades lined the walls, their painted eyes following her progress with ancestral judgment. Her fingers began to tremble despite her best efforts to still them. Edmund leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "The first day is always the most difficult," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "It becomes easier with time." Clara wondered if he spoke from experience or merely offered empty platitudes. Before she could determine which, the drawing-room doors swung open, revealing a chamber of gilt and crimson. The Duchess Dowager was already seated by the fire, her ramrod posture a silent demand for propriety. "Come, child," she commanded. "Let me look upon you properly." Clara stepped forward on legs that threatened to fold beneath her. As she approached the Duchess Dowager, her foot caught upon the edge of the Persian carpet. She stumbled, her balance deserting her entirely, and pitched forward with a small cry of alarm. A strong arm caught her before she could fall. Edmund's grip was steady, unflinching. "Careful," he murmured, his voice betraying no emotion. "The rugs in this house have claimed many dignities before yours." The Duchess Dowager's gaze narrowed. "I see Grace is not among her accomplishments." The first week of marriage passed in a fog of formality and unspoken expectations. Clara learned the labyrinthine corridors of Ravenshade House, the rigid schedule of meals, the exact temperature at which the Duchess Dowager preferred her tea, yet her husband remained an enigma, present at dinner, absent at breakfast, glimpsed occasionally in the library, or disappearing down the long gallery with his steward. Each night, Clara prepared herself for the inevitable. Each night, Edmund knocked politely upon the connecting door between their chambers, entered to bid her good night, and departed without advancing a single step toward her bed. The wedding night itself, that moment of quiet terror she had anticipated with such dread, had culminated in nothing more than a formal bow and his withdrawal. "You seem distracted this morning, Lady Ravenshade," the Duchess Dowager observed over breakfast, her silver spoon clinking against bone china with metronome precision. "I do hope you're not falling ill. Nothing is more tedious than a sickly daughter-in-law." Clara forced herself to meet the older woman's gaze. "I am quite well, Your Grace, merely adjusting to my new surroundings." "Humph." The Duchess sipped her tea. "Edmund has informed me that you are to accompany me to Lady Hargrove's tea this afternoon. I trust you have suitable attire. The Hargroves are particular about appearances, and we cannot have you reflecting poorly upon this house." "I believe my wardrobe is adequate, though perhaps not to London standards." Clara kept her voice level despite the familiar shame creeping up her neck. Her trousseau, hastily assembled from outdated gowns, was a constant reminder of her family's reduced circumstances. "We shall see," the Duchess sniffed. "My maid will attend you at 11. Josephine has an eye for such things, and will make any necessary adjustments." Clara inclined her head in acknowledgement, keenly aware that this was not an act of kindness, but another method of control. "You are most considerate, Your Grace. I am practical, child. Nothing more." The Duchess set down her cup with finality. "The reputation of this house has stood unblemished for 3 centuries. I have no intention of allowing it to falter now because of a poorly trimmed bonnet." Later, as Josephine fussed over the modest blue silk that was Clara's best afternoon dress, pinning and tucking with silent efficiency, Clara gazed out the window at the Ravenshade gardens. Formal parterres stretched in geometric precision, not a bloom out of place, not a leaf allowed to stray beyond its designated boundary, much like the inhabitants of the house itself. "There, my lady," Josephine announced, stepping back to assess her work. "The Duchess will find no fault now." Clara examined her reflection in the cheval glass. The gown, once merely adequate, now draped elegantly across her slight frame. "You have worked wonders, Josephine. I am most grateful." The maid's expression softened momentarily. "It's a beautiful color with your complexion, my lady. The late afternoon light at Hargrove House will be most flattering." Before Clara could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Josephine opened it to reveal Edmund, impeccably attired in a charcoal frock coat, his cravat a study in precision. "My mother asked me to escort you downstairs," he said, his gaze moving from Clara to the altered gown and back again. "Blue becomes you, Lady Ravenshade." Clara felt a flush rise unbidden to her cheeks. "Thank you, Edmund. Josephine has been most helpful in making my attire suitable for the occasion." "Indeed." His expression remained unreadable. "Shall we?" Mother detests tardiness above all things. The Hargrove tea proved to be a crucible of subtle cruelties and veiled insults. Clara found herself seated among London's elite, their curious gazes dissecting her provincial manners and hastily altered gown. Lady Hargrove, a woman whose beauty had curdled into spite with age, held court at the centre of the room. "And tell us, Lady Ravenshade," she said, her voice carrying deliberately across the assembled ladies, "how do you find married life? One imagines it must be quite an adjustment from your rural upbringing." Clara felt the weight of every eye upon her, the silent anticipation of her humiliation. The teacup trembled almost imperceptibly in her hand. "Marriage has brought many changes, Lady Hargrove. Fortunately, the Duke has been most patient with my transition to London society." "Patience is indeed a virtue," Lady Hargrove replied with a thin smile, "though I confess I find it surprising that Edmund Ravenshade should suddenly exhibit such a quality." Your husband, my dear, has quite the reputation for exacting standards and little tolerance for inadequacy. The words struck like precision blades, designed to draw blood without leaving visible wounds. Clara felt her heart quicken, her fingers tightening around the delicate handle of her cup. Perhaps, came a cool voice from the doorway, you simply never provided sufficient cause for my patience, Victoria. Edmund stood in the entrance, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. Every lady in the room straightened imperceptibly, even the formidable Lady Hargrove herself. "So, Your Grace," Lady Hargrove recovered quickly. "What a delightful surprise. Gentlemen so rarely grace us with their presence at afternoon tea." "I came to escort my wife and mother home," Edmund replied, crossing to stand behind Clara's chair. "I find I cannot bear to be parted from Lady Ravensshade for long." The declaration hung in the air like suspended crystal, catching the light and refracting it in unexpected directions. Clara felt his hand come to rest lightly upon her shoulder. The first time he had touched her in public since their wedding day. "How terribly romantic," Lady Hargrove observed, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "One wouldn't have thought you so inclined, Your Grace." "There are many things about me you do not know, Victoria." Edmund's voice remained pleasant, but Clara sensed steel beneath the silk. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe my wife has endured quite enough." Hospitality for one afternoon. As they departed, Clara felt the heat of scandalized whispers scorching her back. The Duchess Dowager walked ahead with rigid dignity, her displeasure evident in every precise step. When they reached the carriage, she turned to Edmund with glacial fury. "That display was most unnecessary," she hissed. "You have given the gossips fodder for weeks." Edmund handed his mother into the carriage with perfect courtesy. "On the contrary, mother, I believe I have merely redirected their attention. They will now speculate about my supposed infatuation rather than Clara's perceived shortcomings. Which would you prefer?" The library at Ravensshade House had stood unchanged for generations, its oak shelves towering to the coffered ceiling, each volume precisely placed according to subject and author. It was here that Clara sought refuge on rainy afternoons, losing herself in the worlds contained between leather bindings. "So you favor the poets, I see." Edmund's voice startled her from her contemplation of Wordsworth. He stood in the doorway, a letter in his hand, watching her with that same inscrutable expression. Clara closed the book carefully. "They speak to me in ways I find difficult to articulate myself. The best portion of a good man's life is little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and love," Edmund quoted, advancing into the room. "Wordsworth understood the essence of virtue better than most." "You know his work," Clara observed, surprised by this glimpse of something beyond rigid propriety. "I attended Cambridge, Lady Ravensshade," he replied with the ghost of a smile. "Even dukes are occasionally subjected to education." She felt herself flush. "I did not mean to imply—" "No offense taken." He waved away her apology and extended the letter. "This arrived for you this morning." Clara accepted the envelope, immediately recognizing her father's uneven script. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. "Is something amiss?" Edmund inquired, noticing her hesitation. "No," she replied too quickly. "Merely correspondence from home." His gaze lingered on her face, seeing more than she wished to reveal. "I shall leave you to your privacy then." "Thank you," she whispered, waiting until the door closed behind him before unfolding the single page. Her father's words swam before her eyes, platitudes about her mother's health, inquiries after her comfort, and then finally, the true purpose of the letter, a request for additional funds beyond the agreed-upon settlement. The familiar shame washed over her. Even now, married and removed from their household, she remained a commodity to be bartered. She was still staring at the letter when Edmund returned an hour later, a ledger tucked beneath his arm. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, pausing at the sight of her tear-stained face. "Clara?" It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal title preceding it. The sound of it in his deep voice caused something to shift within her chest. "It is nothing," she replied, hastily folding the letter. "Merely homesickness." Edmund crossed to her, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "May I?" He gestured to the adjacent chair. She nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I have observed that nothing rarely produces such distress," he said quietly. "Is there something I might assist with?" Clara hesitated. The truth would reveal her family's true character, their desperation and greed, and yet the weight of carrying this burden alone suddenly seemed unbearable. "My father writes requesting additional funds," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "The settlement was substantial, more than generous, and yet it is never enough," Edmund finished for her. She looked up, surprised by the lack of judgment in his tone. "You are not angry?" "Why should I be?" He leaned back, studying her with those penetrating grey eyes. Your father's character is not a reflection upon yours, Clara, just as my mother's sharp tongue bears no relation to my own thoughts. But you must think my family terribly grasping. I think, he said carefully, that desperate circumstances often drive people to actions they might otherwise find reprehensible. Your father's estate was failing long before our marriage was arranged. The settlement was calculated to resolve those debts, not to fund continued excesses. Clara felt the familiar defensive words rise to her lips, explanations, justifications for her father's behavior, but found she could not speak them aloud. The truth of Edmund's assessment was too stark to deny. "What shall I do?" she asked instead. Edmund considered her question with the same careful attention he might give a legal document. "You have several options. You may decline his request entirely. You may grant it with the understanding that it is the final such accommodation. Or," he paused, "you may allow me to address the matter directly. You would speak with him? If you wish it." His voice remained neutral. "Though I suspect such an intervention might strain your relationship with your parents further." Clara twisted her handkerchief between her fingers. "They sold me to pay their debts," she whispered, giving voice to the thought she had suppressed since the marriage negotiations began. "What relationship remains to preserve?" Edmund leaned forward, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "No one sold you, Clara. A marriage was arranged, as has been the custom among our class for centuries. The financial aspects, while significant, were secondary to the alliance between our families." "Is that truly what you believe?" she asked, searching his face for signs of deception. "It is what I choose to believe," he replied with unexpected candor, "and what I would have you believe as well, if it brings you any measure of peace." The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 4, breaking the fragile moment between them. Edmund straightened, resuming his customary reserve. "The decision regarding your father's request is yours alone," he said, rising from his chair. "Whatever you choose, I shall support. Your quarterly allowance is substantial, more than adequate for both personal expenses and familial generosity, should you be so inclined." Clara stood as well, clutching the letter like a shield. "Thank you for your understanding, Edmund. It is more than I expected." "Perhaps," he said, pausing at the door, "it is time you adjusted your expectations, Lady Ravenshade. Not all surprises in life are unpleasant ones." As he departed, Clara remained in the library, watching the rain trace patterns down the leaded glass. For the first time since entering Ravenshade House, she felt something other than fear or resignation. It was a fragile sensation, as delicate as a bird's wing, the possibility that this arranged marriage might offer something beyond mere endurance. That evening, as she sat before her dressing table while her maid arranged her hair for dinner, a knock sounded at the door. The maid answered it, returning with a small package wrapped in cream-coloured paper. "From His Grace, my lady," she said, presenting it with a curtsy. Clara untied the simple ribbon with fingers that suddenly seemed clumsy. Inside lay a slim volume of poetry, Wordsworth bound in soft green leather. A slip of paper marked one page, and when she opened it she found a single line underlined in Edmund's precise hand. "The mind that is within us, so impress with quietness and beauty, and so feed with lofty thoughts, that neither evil tongues, rash judgments, nor the sneers of selfish men shall e'er prevail against us." The morning dawned clear and bright, a rare respite from London's perpetual gloom. Clara stood at her bedroom window, watching the gardeners below as they pruned the formal hedges with mathematical precision. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival at Ravenshade House, yet she remained an outsider, tolerated rather than welcomed, observed rather than known. "My lady," her maid appeared in the doorway. "His Grace requests your presence in the morning room at your earliest convenience." Clara's heart quickened. Such a summons was unprecedented. "Did he mention the purpose?" "No, my lady, only that the matter was of some importance." Clara dressed with particular care, selecting a morning gown of pale green muslin that Edmund had once remarked brought out the colour in her eyes. As she descended the grand staircase, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the gilded mirrors, a slender figure in green, still looking somewhat lost amidst the grandeur of Ravenshade House. Edmund awaited her in the morning room, standing before the window with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned at her entrance, his expression unreadable as always. "Lady Ravenshade," he greeted her with a slight bow. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "You wished to see me?" Clara clasped her hands before her to disguise their slight tremor. "Indeed." He gestured to a chair. "Please, be seated. What I have to discuss requires some explanation." Clara perched on the edge of the damask-covered chair, her posture rigid with apprehension. Edmund remained standing, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the Turkish carpet. "I have received correspondence from my solicitor," Regarding certain matters pertaining to your father's estate, he began, his tone formal. It appears that the situation is more dire than initially represented during our marriage negotiations. The familiar shame washed over her. I see. No, I don't believe you do. Edmund's voice softened unexpectedly. Clara, your father has mortgaged Whitmore Park 3 times over. The debts far exceed the value of the property itself. Even the settlement I provided has been misappropriated. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Misappropriated. The funds were intended to satisfy the most pressing creditors. Instead, it appears your father used a significant portion to purchase a racing stallion of questionable pedigree and to cover extensive gambling losses at White's. The room seemed to tilt around her. All her life, Clara had defended her father's increasingly reckless financial decisions, had believed his promises of imminent recovery and restoration. Now, hearing the stark truth in Edmund's measured tones, she could no longer maintain the comforting illusions. What will happen to Whitmore Park? She whispered, thinking of the beloved home where generations of her family had lived and died. Edmund sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a rare gesture of agitation. Without intervention, it will be sold at auction within the month. Your parents will be forced to vacate. And with intervention, Clara looked up at him, suddenly desperate. I could purchase the estate outright, satisfy the creditors, and ensure your parents retain a lifetime right of residence. His voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than the salvation of her family's ancestral home. Clara stared at him in disbelief. You would do this? After my father has proven himself so unworthy? I would do this for you, Clara. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, but I require something in return. She tensed, awaiting the unnamed price for such generosity. Your trust, he said quietly, and your promise that you will cease to shoulder the burden of your father's poor decisions. His actions are not your responsibility to bear or to justify. Of all the conditions she might have anticipated, this was perhaps the most unexpected. My trust? Yes. Edmund moved to sit opposite her, his grey eyes intent upon her face. Since our wedding day, you have regarded me with fear, Clara. You flinch when I enter a room. You tremble when I speak to you. While I understand the circumstances of our marriage were not of your choosing, I would have you see me as an ally rather than a jailer. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, mortified by his accurate assessment. I never meant to. I know, he interrupted gently. Fear is rarely a conscious choice, but trust can be. I am asking you to choose it now, not merely for the sake of your family's estate, but for the possibility of building something worthwhile between us. A single tear escaped, trailing down her cheek. She brushed it away with trembling fingers. I would like to try. Then consider it done. Edmund rose, his manner becoming businesslike once more. I shall instruct my solicitor to proceed with the purchase immediately. Thank you, Clara whispered, overwhelmed by his generosity. There is one more matter, he continued, retrieving a small velvet box from his desk. The jewels of the Ravenshade family traditionally passed to the Duchess upon marriage. My mother has retained them since my father's death, but certain pieces are rightfully yours. He opened the box to reveal a necklace of sapphires and diamonds, their facets catching the morning light in dazzling prismatic flashes. These belong to my grandmother. My mother finds them excessively ostentatious for her tastes, which I suspect is her way of acknowledging they should be yours. Clara gasped at the magnificence of the jewels. Edmund, I couldn't possibly. You can, and you will, he said firmly. You are the Duchess of Ravenshade. It is time both you and everyone else in this household remembered that fact. Before she could formulate a response, the door opened to admit the Duchess Dowager, her timing suspicious enough to suggest deliberate eavesdropping. I see you've given her the sapphires, she observed, her gaze sweeping over the open box. I suppose they suit her colouring well enough, though they always appeared rather gaudy against the family portraits. Edmund's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. Mother, I don't recall inviting you to join our discussion. I am still mistress of this house, Edmund, the older woman replied coolly. Or have you forgotten that in your rush to elevate your bride's position? Clara felt herself shrinking beneath the Duchess Dowager's glacial disapproval, but Edmund's next words arrested her retreat. You are mistaken, Mother, he said, his voice quiet but inflexible. Clara is the Duchess of Ravenshade. She has been since the moment our vows were exchanged. Any authority you exercise within these walls exists solely at our discretion. The Duchess Dowager's face blanched white, then flushed with anger. I see. And is this your opinion as well, child? She demanded, turning to Clara. Do you seek to usurp my position so soon? Clara felt caught between loyalty to her husband and fear of his mother's formidable displeasure. The sapphires glittered in their box, a tangible symbol of the choice before her. Slowly, she rose to her feet, forcing herself to meet the older woman's challenging gaze. "I seek to honor my husband and the position to which he has elevated me," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have no desire for conflict, Your Grace, but neither will I diminish myself to preserve false harmony." The Duchess Dowager's eyes widened in momentary shock at this unexpected display of backbone. Then, remarkably, the corner of her mouth twitched in what might almost have been approval. "Well," she said briskly, "perhaps there is more to you than meets the eye, after all, Lady Ravenshade. We shall see how long this newfound courage lasts." She swept toward the door, pausing on the threshold. "The Merryweathers' ball is tomorrow evening. I expect both of you to attend. The sapphires would not be inappropriate for such an occasion." With that pronouncement, she departed, leaving Clara breathless with the after-effects of confrontation. "That," Edmund observed dryly, "is the closest my mother has ever come to offering a compliment." Clara sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "I fear I may have made an enemy." "On the contrary," Edmund replied, closing the jewel box and placing it in her hands. "You have earned her respect, which is far more valuable. The Duchess Dowager despises weakness above all things." The Merryweathers' ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting from gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers until the entire chamber seemed illuminated from within. Clara stood at the entrance, the raven-shade sapphires cool against her throat, Edmund's steadying hand at her elbow. The Duchess Dowager had preceded them into the crush, her silver head visible among the elite of London society. "Remember," Edmund murmured, "you have as much right to be here as any of them. More, in fact, considering half the aristocracy is indebted to the raven-shade coffers." Clara managed a small smile at this sardonic observation. "Is that meant to be comforting?" "Merely factual," he replied. "Ah, Lady Merryweather approaches. Brace yourself for effusive flattery delivered with maximum insincerity." Their hostess, a plump woman whose coral silk gown strained alarmingly across her ample bosom, descended upon them with fluttering hands and practiced delight. "Your Grace, how utterly divine that you have honored us with your presence. And Lady Ravenshade, what a vision you are. Those sapphires are simply magnificent. Family heirlooms, I presume." "Indeed," Edmund replied, his tone pleasant but reserved. "They have adorned the necks of raven-shade duchesses for generations." "How perfectly lovely," Lady Merryweather cooed, her eyes calculating the approximate value of the gems. "You must circulate, my dears. Everyone is simply dying to make the new Duchess's acquaintance. Such a romantic match, after all." As she fluttered away to greet new arrivals, Edmund leaned close to Clara's ear. "And thus begins the parade of curiosity disguised as courtesy." For the next hour, Clara found herself passed from one aristocratic gathering to another, subjected to veiled inquiries about her background, her marriage, and her adjustment to ducal life. She answered with carefully constructed politeness, grateful for Edmund's solid presence beside her. "Lady Ravenshade," a silken voice intruded, "how utterly charming to see you again." Clara turned to find herself face to face with Lady Hargrove, whose smile contained all the warmth of a midwinter frost. Beside her stood a young woman of striking beauty, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, her blue eyes assessing Clara with undisguised curiosity. "Lady Hargrove," Clara acknowledged with a slight curtsy, "how kind of you to greet us." "I could hardly ignore the evening's most intriguing couple," the older woman replied. "May I present my niece, Miss Sophia Blackwood? She has only recently returned from finishing school in Switzerland." The golden-haired beauty dipped in a perfect curtsy, her gaze sliding from Clara to Edmund with unmistakable interest. "Your Grace, Lady Ravenshade, it is an honor to make your acquaintance at last. Aunt Victoria has spoken of little else since your marriage." "Has she indeed?" Edmund's tone was polite, but Clara detected a note of wariness beneath the courtesy. How flattering to occupy Lady Hargrove's thoughts so completely. Lady Hargrove's smile tightened. "Sophia, my dear, you must tell the Duchess about your accomplishments. I believe you share an interest in poetry." "Oh, indeed." Miss Blackwood's face brightened with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "Though I favor the romantics. Byron, especially. There is something so wonderfully passionate about his verse, don't you agree, Lady Ravenshade?" Before Clara could respond, Lady Hargrove added with practiced casualness, "Sophia was quite the favorite at school. Her recitations were renowned. Perhaps, Your Grace, you might persuade her to demonstrate her talents at your next musical evening. I recall you were always most appreciative of artistic expression during your bachelor days." The implication hung in the air like perfume, too strong to ignore, too subtle to directly challenge. Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she glanced between Miss Blackwood's perfect features and Edmund's suddenly impassive expression. How interesting, Clara heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. I was not aware that His Grace hosted such gatherings. Oh, they were quite legendary, Lady Hargrove continued, apparently oblivious to the tension her words had created. The most select company, the finest performers. Your husband has always been a discerning patron of the arts. A rather embellished recollection, Lady Hargrove, Edmund interjected smoothly. But then, exaggeration has always been among your many talents. The orchestra struck up a waltz, providing a timely interruption. Edmund turned to Clara with a formal bow. I believe this is our dance, Duchess. As he led her onto the floor, Clara could feel curious gazes following their progress. The raven-shade sapphires seemed suddenly heavy around her neck. You are quiet, Edmund observed as they took their positions. Miss Blackwood is very beautiful, Clara replied, unable to disguise the uncertainty in her voice. Edmund's hand settled at her waist, his touch firm but respectful as he guided her into the first steps of the waltz. She is designed to be so. What does that mean? It means, my dear, that Sophia Blackwood has been groomed since childhood to secure an advantageous match. Her beauty, her accomplishments, even her supposed passion for Byron, all carefully cultivated to appeal to men of certain standing and fortune. Clara considered this as they moved through the intricate patterns of the dance. Were you acquainted with her before? Edmund's expression softened slightly. Are you asking if she was among my legendary gatherings, as Lady Hargrove so delicately implied? I suppose I am, Clara admitted, feeling a strange twist of emotion she was reluctant to name as jealousy. The answer is no, he said firmly. Miss Blackwood was indeed in Switzerland until quite recently. Lady Hargrove's insinuations are precisely that, attempts to unsettle you and test the boundaries of our marriage. His eyes held hers with unexpected intensity. A marriage which, despite its arrangement, I have come to value considerably. The admission, so simply stated, caused Clara's heart to stutter in its rhythm. Before she could formulate a response, Edmund continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. There is something you should know about Lady Hargrove. She once harbored hopes that I might offer for her daughter, a match my mother actually favored. When I declined, citing incompatibility of temperament, Lady Hargrove took it as a personal affront. She has nursed that grievance for years. And now she seeks to undermine your choice of me instead, Clara concluded, the pieces falling into place. Precisely. Edmund's hand tightened slightly at her waist, though her tactics are rather transparent. Clara found herself smiling, despite the undercurrent of tension. Then we must present a united front against such manipulation. Indeed we must. Edmund's eyes warmed with something that might almost have been admiration. You continue to surprise me, Lady Ravenshade. The music swelled around them, and Clara surrendered herself to the rhythm and the unexpected pleasure of her husband's arms. For a fleeting moment, the ballroom with its watching eyes and whispered judgments receded, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of shared understanding. As the waltz concluded, Edmund escorted her from the floor with perfect courtesy. They had taken no more than a dozen steps when a commotion near the entrance hall drew all eyes. Is that? Clara began, then stopped, as she recognized the figure being reluctantly admitted by the Merryweather's butler. Your father, Edmund confirmed, his expression darkening, and by the look of him, in no condition for polite society. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as Charles Whitmore staggered slightly, his complexion flushed, his cravat askew. Even from across the room she could sense his agitation and the tangible discomfort of those nearest to him. I must go to him, she whispered, mortification warring with daughterly concern. Edmund's hand at her elbow tightened. We will go together. They crossed the ballroom floor, aware of conversations dying as they passed, of curious glances following their progress. Clara held herself rigidly upright, the raven-shade sapphires a cold weight against her collarbone, a reminder of all she now represented. Father, she said quietly as they reached him, this is unexpected. Charles Whitmore swayed slightly, his bloodshot eyes focusing on her with difficulty. Clara, my girl, had to see you, matter of utmost urgency. The scent of brandy wafted from him, confirming Clara's worst fears. Her father was thoroughly intoxicated. Mr. Whitmore, Edmund's voice cut through the awkward silence. Perhaps we might continue this discussion somewhere more private, but Charles seemed beyond such considerations, his gaze fixed on the sapphires at Clara's throat, his expression darkening with alcohol-fueled belligerence, decking her out in jewels while her family faces ruin. He slurred, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. That's rich, Ravenshade, very rich indeed. The silence that fell over the immediate vicinity seemed to expand outward, a ripple of shock spreading through the glittering assemblage. Clara stood frozen, caught between her father's swaying form and the rigid tension of her husband beside her. From the corner of her eye, she glimpsed Lady Hargrove's avid expression, the unmistakable satisfaction of a predator scenting blood. "Mr. Whitmore," Edmund spoke again, his voice pitched low but carrying an unmistakable authority. "You are unwell. Allow me to call for my carriage to convey you home." "Unwell?" Charles laughed, the sound brittle and too loud. "Is that what you call it when a man's been robbed of his dignity, his daughter, and now his ancestral home?" Clara felt rather than saw the collective intake of breath from those close enough to hear. Her father's words had cast their marriage in the crudest possible light, a mercenary transaction rather than a respectable alliance. "Father, please," she whispered, reaching for his arm. "This is neither the time nor the place." "When is the time, Clara?" He jerked away from her touch, nearly losing his balance in the process. "When they've sold off every stick of furniture. When your mother and I are turned out into the street. Ravenshade here promised to save Whitmore Park, but my solicitor tells me the purchase agreement includes conditions. Conditions that would make me little more than a tenant in my own home." Edmund's face had become a mask of control, betraying nothing of his thoughts. "Your solicitor should not have discussed confidential matters with you in your present state, Mr. Whitmore. I suggest we continue this conversation tomorrow when cooler heads might prevail." "Cooler heads?" Charles's voice rose dangerously. "Easy for you to say, with your dukedom and your wealth. You've taken everything. My daughter, my home, even my self-respect." The Duchess Dowager appeared suddenly at Edmund's elbow, her expression glacial. "You are making a spectacle of yourself, Mr. Whitmore, and by extension, of this family. I suggest you accept my son's offer of transportation before you do irreparable damage to what remains of your reputation." Charles seemed to deflate slightly under her withering gaze, his momentary bravado collapsing into maudlin self-pity. "Everyone's against me," he muttered, "my own daughter included." Clara felt the sting of his words like a physical blow. All her life she had defended him, made excuses for his failings, shouldered the burden of his poor decisions. Yet in this moment, before all of society, he had betrayed her utterly. "That is quite enough." Edmund's voice had gone dangerously soft. "Lord Merryweather, might I impose upon you for the use of your study? My father-in-law requires a moment of privacy to compose himself." Their host materialized from the crowd, his expression a mixture of concern and barely concealed fascination with the unfolding drama. "Of course, Your Grace. Simpson will show you the way." As the butler stepped forward, Edmund turned to Clara. "Wait here with my mother. I shall attend to this matter personally." "Edmund?" she began, uncertain whether she meant to thank him or protest. "Trust me," he murmured, so low that only she could hear. Those two simple words, an echo of their earlier conversation, steadied her. Clara nodded once, watching as Edmund guided her swaying father from the ballroom with a firm hand at his elbow, preserving what little dignity remained possible. As they disappeared, the assembled guests erupted into a buzz of whispered speculation. The Duchess Dowager's hand closed around Clara's wrist like a vice. "Stand straight," she commanded. "Do not allow them to see you waver for an instant." Clara drew a deep breath, forcing steel into her spine. "What shall we do now?" "We shall circulate," the older woman replied calmly, as if scenes of public intoxication were commonplace at society functions. "You will smile and converse as if nothing untoward has occurred. I shall accompany you." For the next half hour, Clara moved through the ballroom like a sleepwalker, exchanging pleasantries and deflecting curious inquiries with a composure she scarcely knew she possessed. The Duchess Dowager remained at her side, a formidable bulwark against the most intrusive questions. "You are conducting yourself admirably," the older woman observed during a rare moment when they stood apart from other guests. "Perhaps there is Ravenshade steel in you after all." Coming from the Duchess Dowager, this qualified as high praise indeed. Clara inclined her head in acknowledgement, too drained for verbal response. "He will ruin you both if you allow it," the Duchess continued, her gaze fixed on the doorway through which Edmund and Charles had departed. "Your father." "He is unwell," Clara said automatically, the familiar defense rising to her lips. "He is weak," the Duchess corrected sharply. "There is a difference. Illness can be cured. Weakness of character is a permanent affliction." Before Clara could formulate a response to this harsh assessment, the ballroom doors opened to reveal Edmund, his expression grave but composed. He crossed to them with measured steps that betrayed nothing of his inner thoughts. "Your father has been conveyed home in our carriage," he informed Clara quietly. "Jenkins will ensure he arrives safely. I believe it would be best if we departed as well. The evening has been eventful enough." The Duchess Dowager nodded once, approving this prudent course of action. "I shall inform Lady Merryweather of our withdrawal. The carriage will return shortly." As his mother swept away, Edmund's attention focused fully on Clara. "Are you unwell? You are exceedingly pale." "I am mortified," she whispered, the careful composure she had maintained beginning to crack. "What he said, what everyone heard, is of no consequence," Edmund interrupted gently. "Society gossip is like London weather, unpleasant but temporary. By next week some other unfortunate soul will provide fresh material for their speculation." Despite everything, Clara felt a watery smile touch her lips. "You are remarkably sanguine about public humiliation." "A useful quality in a duke," he replied with the ghost of a smile. "We are frequent targets for both adulation and criticism, often in equal measure." The Duchess Dowager returned to announce the carriage would arrive momentarily. As they made their farewells to their hosts, Clara became aware of Lady Hargrove watching their departure with poorly concealed satisfaction. "She believes she has witnessed our downfall," Clara murmured to Edmund as they descended the grand staircase. "She is mistaken," he replied simply, "as she has been about many things." The journey back to Ravenshade House passed in silence, each occupant of the carriage absorbed in private thoughts. Clara watched the shadowed streets of London slide past the window, her mind replaying her father's bitter accusations. Had Edmund truly imposed conditions that would humiliate her father further? The thought seemed at odds with the man she was beginning to know. Upon their arrival, the Duchess Dowager announced her intention to retire immediately. As she ascended the stairs, she paused to address Clara with unexpected directness. "You conducted yourself with dignity this evening, despite considerable provocation. I am not displeased." With that remarkably restrained compliment, she continued to her chambers. Left alone in the grand entrance hall, Clara turned to Edmund with the question she could no longer contain. "Is it true about the conditions on Whitmore Park?" Edmund sighed, suddenly looking weary beyond his years. "Would you care for tea in the library? This conversation requires more privacy than the entrance hall affords." Clara nodded, following him through the silent house to the sanctuary of book-lined walls and comfortable chairs. A footman appeared as if by magic to light the fire and depart again with instructions to bring tea. "The conditions your father referenced," Edmund began once they were alone, "are simple protections. He cannot mortgage the property again. He cannot sell the furniture or artworks without approval. And yes, he is required to maintain the estate in good repair." He ran a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of frustration. "These are not punitive measures, Clara. They are necessary safeguards against his self-destruction. And if he violates these terms, then control of the estate reverts fully to me," Edmund admitted, "but he would retain lifetime residence, as would your mother. I have no desire to see them homeless, regardless of your father's behavior this evening." Clara felt a weight lift from her heart. "You are more generous than he deserves." "Perhaps," Edmund acknowledged, "but my concern was never for him." Their eyes met across the room, and Clara felt a strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. "Why did you marry me, Edmund? Truly? It cannot have been merely for the Whitmore connection, which brings you nothing but complications." Edmund was silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. "I married you because my mother presented a list of suitable candidates, and you were the only one who did not regard marriage to me as a triumph." Clara blinked in surprise. "I don't understand." "When we were introduced at Lady Hargrove's musical evening last season, you curtsied and spoke the proper words, but your eyes—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your eyes held resignation, not calculation. You saw me as an obligation to be endured, not a prize to be won. It was refreshing." "That is hardly flattering," Clara observed, uncertain how to interpret this peculiar confession. "On the contrary," Edmund replied, a smile touching his lips. "It suggested you might value me for something beyond my title and fortune, should we ever progress beyond formality." The footman's arrival with the tea tray interrupted this unexpected revelation. As Clara poured, her hands were steadier than she had expected, despite the tumult of emotions his words had stirred. "And have we?" she asked quietly, passing him a cup. "Progressed beyond formality?" Edmund accepted the tea, his fingers briefly brushing against hers in a touch that seemed both accidental and deliberate. "I believe we are making promising advances in that direction, Lady Ravenshade." The warmth in his voice caused Clara's cheeks to flush. She busied herself with her own cup, using the ritual of tea to regain her composure. Outside, rain had begun to fall again, pattering against the library windows in a soothing rhythm. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "After tonight's scene, life continues," Edmund replied simply. "Your father will awaken tomorrow with a monumental headache and, one hopes, a clearer perspective on his circumstances. Society will gossip, then move on to fresher scandals, and we—" He paused, setting down his cup with deliberate care. We shall continue becoming acquainted, if that is agreeable to you. Clara felt something unfamiliar unfurl within her chest, a fragile bud of possibility, where before there had been only duty and resignation. It is. Edmund rose, crossing to stand before her chair. Then I bid you good night, Clara. He extended his hand, palm up, an invitation rather than a command. Clara placed her fingers in his, allowing him to draw her gently to her feet. They stood close, the warmth of the fire casting golden light across their features, illuminating details she had not fully noted before, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes, the exact shade of grey in his irises, the surprising softness of his mouth. "Good night, Edmund," she whispered, suddenly aware of her heart's rapid cadence. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that lingered just long enough to be meaningful. "Until tomorrow." As he released her and moved toward the door, Clara remained by the fire, her hand still warm from his touch, her pulse still unsteady. Whatever came next, whatever society whispered or her father demanded, she was beginning to believe that within the walls of Ravenshade House she might find not merely shelter, but belonging. Edmund paused at the threshold, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Clara?" "Yes?" "The sapphires," he said quietly. "They were always meant for you." 3 days after the Merryweathers' ball, London society still buzzed with whispered accounts of Charles Whitmore's disgraceful behaviour. Though Clara had not ventured beyond the walls of Ravenshade House since that evening, the steady stream of calling cards and carefully worded notes suggested that public interest remained undiminished. Some expressed sympathy, others thinly veiled curiosity, but all confirmed that the incident had become the season's most savoured scandal. "Another bouquet has arrived, my lady," Clara's maid announced, entering the morning room with an arrangement of white roses and lilies. "From Lady Ashburton with her compliments." Clara glanced up from her correspondence. "How kind. Please add it to the others." The maid placed the flowers among the dozen similar offerings that crowded every available surface. "Shall I bring the card?" "No need," Clara replied, knowing it would contain the same delicately phrased expressions of support as all the others. Words that concealed an avid hunger for additional details. The door opened again to admit the Duchess Dowager, who surveyed the floral display with raised eyebrows. "One might mistake this for a funeral parlour," she observed dryly. "Though I suppose in a sense it is. The death of your father's social standing is being appropriately mourned." Clara winced at the blunt assessment. "Have you news of him?" "Edmund called at your parents' residence this morning." The older woman settled herself in a chair opposite Clara's writing desk. "Your father was indisposed and would not receive him. Your mother, however, expressed appropriate mortification regarding the entire affair." "Poor mamma," Clara murmured. "She has endured much." "Indeed." The Duchess's tone suggested limited sympathy, though one might argue she made her choice when she married a man of such questionable character. Clara felt the familiar impulse to defend her family rise within her, but found the words hollow before they reached her lips. Had she not made similar observations in the privacy of her own thoughts? The realization was uncomfortable yet undeniable. "Edmund left documents regarding Whitmore Park for your father's signature," the Duchess continued, seemingly oblivious to Clara's inner conflict. "Once executed, they will secure your family's residence while preventing further financial improprieties. And if he refuses to sign, then Edmund will proceed without his cooperation. The estate's creditors are pressing for immediate action, and your husband's patience, while considerable where you are concerned, is not inexhaustible." Clara set aside her pen, abandoning the pretense of attending to correspondence. "You make him sound rather formidable." "He is a Ravenshade," the Duchess replied, as if this explained everything. After a moment she added with reluctant admiration, "Though I confess his handling of this situation has demonstrated a compassion his father might have found excessive." Before Clara could respond to this unexpected concession, the door opened once more to admit Edmund himself. He paused on the threshold, taking in the scene, the profusion of sympathy flowers, his mother's imperial presence, Clara's evident discomfort. "I see the condolences continue to arrive," he observed, crossing to kiss his mother's cheek before turning to Clara with a slight bow. "Good morning, Duchess. I trust you slept well?" The formal address, spoken in the Duchess Dowager's presence, was a subtle reinforcement of Clara's position, a reminder that despite recent events, she remained mistress of Ravenshade House. She offered a small smile of gratitude. "Well enough, thank you. I have just been informing Clara of your visit to Whitmore House," the Duchess Dowager said. "A fruitless errand, it would seem." Edmund's expression revealed nothing. "Not entirely. Mrs. Whitmore provided valuable insights regarding her husband's state of mind." "And what conclusion did you draw from these insights?" his mother inquired. "That grief and shame often manifest as anger," Edmund replied, his gaze meeting Clara's, and that pride can be the most destructive force in a man's character. The Duchess Dowager sniffed, hardly a novel observation, but apt nonetheless. She rose with regal deliberation. I shall leave you to discuss these matters in private. The Countess of Westmoreland expects me for luncheon, and one should never keep a countess waiting, particularly one with such an inexhaustible appetite for gossip. After she had departed, Edmund moved to the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the grey London sky. Your mother sends her love, he said quietly, and her apologies. Clara felt her throat tighten with unshed tears. Did she seem well? Tired, he admitted. Bearing the weight of your father's choices has taken its toll. But she spoke of you with great tenderness. And my father? Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. Edmund turned to face her, his expression softening. He is a proud man, Clara, drowning in circumstances largely of his own making. In time, he may come to recognize the hand extended to save him rather than striking at it, and if he does not, the question emerged as barely more than a whisper. Then we shall proceed as we must, Edmund replied gently. The papers securing Whitmore Park have been left for his signature. With or without it, the property will be preserved, and your parents' residence secured. Beyond that, the choice of reconciliation lies with him. Clara rose, moving to stand beside him at the window. Below Ravenshade House's formal gardens stretched in geometric precision, the first tender greens of spring emerging despite London's perpetual haze. I have been thinking, she said carefully, about your suggestion that we might venture to Ravenshade Abbey when the season concludes, perhaps sooner, if circumstances make London less hospitable. Edmund studied her face with those perceptive grey eyes. The country air would be a welcome change. The estate is at its finest in late spring, the gardens especially. I should like to see them, Clara said sincerely, to begin learning my role as mistress of both houses, if that would be agreeable. Something warmed in Edmund's gaze, a subtle shift that nonetheless transformed his austere features. More than agreeable, Clara. It would be most welcome. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Jenkins, Edmund's valet, entered with an apologetic bow. Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. Lord Harrow has arrived regarding the matter we discussed. He awaits you in the study. Edmund nodded. Inform him I shall attend him shortly. As Jenkins withdrew, he turned back to Clara. Business matters require my attention this afternoon. Would you care to ride in the park tomorrow, weather permitting? The exercise might prove beneficial after so many days indoors. The invitation, so casually extended, represented another small step toward normalcy, toward the possibility of a marriage that might transcend its mercenary beginnings. I should like that very much. Excellent. Edmund moved toward the door, then paused. Clara, there is something else you should know. Lady Hargrove has announced a musical evening next week, to which we have been conspicuously not invited. Clara felt her stomach tighten. I see. The slight is intentional, of course, Edmund continued calmly. A public declaration of our fall from social grace. However, the Duchess of Bedford has issued a more exclusive invitation for the same evening. A small dinner party, which the most influential members of society would never decline. We will be attending as guests of honor. Clara blinked in surprise. The Duchess of Bedford? I was given to understand she rarely entertains outside her immediate circle. She makes exceptions for those she finds intriguing, Edmund replied, with the ghost of a smile. And it seems, my dear, that your dignified response to adversity has captured her interest. The Duchess was most emphatic that she desired your acquaintance. As the implications registered, Clara felt a flicker of astonishment. This is your doing, isn't it? You've arranged a countermove to Lady Hargrove's slight. Edmund's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a gleam of something that might have been pride. The Ravenshades have navigated social waters for generations, Clara. Lady Hargrove overplayed her hand in attempting to capitalize on your father's indiscretion. The Duchess of Bedford despises such obvious maneuvering. It required very little persuasion to secure her cooperation. Nonetheless, I am grateful, Clara said softly. No gratitude is necessary between husband and wife, Edmund replied. We face these challenges as one, do we not? The question held more significance than its simple phrasing suggested. Clara met his gaze steadily. We do. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that required no words. Then Edmund bowed slightly and took his leave, the soft click of the door marking his departure. Clara returned to the window, her mind turning over the events of the past weeks like pages in a well-worn book. The Clara who had entered Ravenshade House as a reluctant bride would scarcely recognize the woman who now stood in her place. Still uncertain, still finding her way but no longer paralyzed by fear of the future or the man to whom she was bound. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the window panes, transforming the view of the garden into an impressionist painting of greens and greys. Yet within, Clara felt a curious warmth blooming, a sensation so unfamiliar that she hesitated to name it hope. The Duchess of Bedford's dining room glowed with the soft radiance of beeswax candles, their light catching the facets of crystal and silver that adorned the table. Only 12 guests had been invited to this intimate gathering. 6 carefully selected couples, representing the very pinnacle of London society. Clara, seated at the Duchess's right hand with Edmund opposite, found herself the object of discreet but avid interest. "Lady Ravenshade," the Duchess addressed her, a woman whose 70 years had done nothing to diminish her formidable presence. "I understand you have a fondness for poetry. Have you read Mrs. Browning's latest collection?" "Indeed, Your Grace," Clara replied, grateful for a topic in which she felt some confidence. "I found her sonnets particularly moving. The balance of intellect and emotion is quite remarkable." The Duchess's shrewd eyes assessed her with approval. "Precisely so. Too many modern poets sacrifice genuine feeling on the altar of technical display. Tell me, do you write yourself?" "Mere scribblings, Your Grace," Clara demurred. "For my own amusement only." The Duchess took a delicate sip of wine. "Most accomplishments worth cultivating begin as mere scribblings, my dear. You must promise to show me your work when you are next at Bedford House." This casual assumption of future intimacy from a woman known for her exclusivity sent a ripple of reaction around the table. Clara caught Lady Melford, whose proximity to the royal family made her an arbiter of social standing, leaning forward with renewed interest. "How delightful," Lady Melford interjected. "Perhaps Lady Ravenshade might honor us with a reading at my literary salon next month. We so rarely encounter fresh perspectives." Clara glanced across the table at Edmund, whose expression revealed nothing beyond polite attentiveness, yet she detected the slightest inclination of his head, encouragement, not direction. "I should be honored, Lady Melford," Clara responded, striving for a balance between modesty and confidence, "though I fear my contributions may pale beside those of your usual participants." "Nonsense," the Duchess of Bedford declared, with the assurance of one accustomed to having the final word. "False modesty is as tedious as excessive pride, my dear. Own your talents without apology. It is the only way a woman makes her mark in this world of men." Lord Hargrove, seated farther down the table, cleared his throat. "Speaking of making one's mark, I understand congratulations are in order, Ravenshade. My man of business informs me you've secured that troublesome property in Whitmore. A sound investment, I should think." The deliberate reference to Clara's family estate created a momentary stillness. Edmund set down his wineglass with precision. "Indeed," he replied evenly, "though my interest extends beyond mere financial considerations, the property has significant historical value, which I am committed to preserving." "How commendable," Lady Melford observed, her quick eyes moving between Edmund and Clara. "So few of the younger generation appreciate the importance of heritage. Don't you agree, Lady Ravenshade?" Clara felt the weight of expectation in the question. Her response would be scrutinized, interpreted, repeated in drawing rooms across London. She drew a steadying breath. "I believe," she said carefully, "that heritage is worthy of preservation, but not at the expense of progress. The most enduring estates are those that honor their past while embracing their future." "Well said," the Duchess of Bedford declared with evident satisfaction. "Ravenshade, your wife possesses both sense and sensibility, a rarer combination than one might suppose." Edmund's gaze met Clara's across the candlelit table. "I am increasingly aware of my good fortune, Your Grace." As the conversation shifted to politics and the recent parliamentary debates, Clara found herself observing her husband with new eyes. In this setting, among his peers, Edmund wore his authority with effortless grace. Respected, even deferred to on matters of consequence, yet there was a reserve about him, a careful distance maintained between his public persona and some deeper, more private self that he revealed to few. To her, perhaps, in those quiet moments when formality slipped away. The dinner progressed through its elaborate courses, each plate a miniature work of art that Clara barely tasted, so intent was she on navigating the subtle currents of conversation. By the time the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, leaving the gentlemen to their port and politics, she felt as though she had passed some unspoken test. "You have acquitted yourself admirably, my dear," the Duchess of Bedford remarked, patting the sofa beside her in clear invitation. "Come sit by me. I wish to know you better." Clara obeyed, acutely conscious of the other ladies watching this display of favor, with varying degrees of surprise and calculation. The Duchess, apparently indifferent to their scrutiny, fixed Clara with a penetrating gaze. "Now," she said in a voice pitched for Clara's ears alone, "tell me honestly, how do you find marriage to Edmund Ravenshade? He is a man of exceptional qualities, but not, I think, an easy one to know." The directness of the question momentarily took Clara aback. We are still becoming acquainted, Your Grace." The Duchess's mouth quirked in a knowing smile. "A diplomatic answer. Allow me to speak plainly, Lady Ravenshade. I have known Edmund since he was in short coats. His father was a cold man who viewed emotions as weaknesses to be conquered. The son learned his lessons well, perhaps too well." Clara remained silent, uncertain how to respond to these unexpected confidences. "What Edmund requires," the Duchess continued, apparently undeterred by Clara's hesitation, "is not a wife who fears him, or one who seeks to manage him, but a true companion who will neither yield to his every dictate nor attempt to bend him to her will. A woman of both strength and tenderness." Her shrewd eyes assessed Clara thoughtfully. "I begin to think he may have found her." Before Clara could formulate a response to this startling pronouncement, the drawing-room doors opened to readmit the gentleman. Edmund's gaze sought her immediately, something in his expression softening when he found her seated beside the Duchess. "I hope my wife has not exhausted you with literary discussions, Your Grace," he remarked as he approached. "On the contrary," the Duchess replied, "Lady Ravenshade has proved a most stimulating conversationalist. Indeed, I have extracted her promise to visit me at Bedford House next week for a more thorough exploration of Mrs. Browning's sonnets." Edmund's eyebrows rose slightly at this evidence of the Duchess's approval. "Clara has a particular gift for interpretation. You will find her insights illuminating." The evening concluded with expressions of mutual esteem that left no doubt as to its success. As their carriage rolled away from Bedford House, Clara settled against the velvet squabs, a curious mixture of triumph and exhaustion washing over her. "You were magnificent," Edmund observed, his voice warm in the intimate darkness. "The Duchess rarely extends such immediate approbation. Even my mother had to work considerably harder to secure her favor." Clara smiled at this unexpected compliment. "I merely answered her questions truthfully. Perhaps that is the secret," Edmund mused. "Authenticity is a rare commodity in our circles. The Duchess would recognize and value it." The carriage swayed gently as it navigated London's cobbled streets, the rhythmic motion oddly soothing. Clara found herself studying Edmund's profile in the faint illumination that filtered through the windows, the strong line of his jaw, the thoughtful set of his mouth. "The Duchess said something rather peculiar," she ventured after a moment, "about your father." Edmund's expression stilled. "My father was a complicated man." She suggested he was emotionally austere. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady clop of hooves and the creak of leather harness. Just as Clara began to regret broaching the subject, Edmund spoke. "My father believed that sentiment was incompatible with duty," he said quietly, "that to govern effectively, whether a dukedom or a household, one must set aside personal inclinations in favor of rational judgment." "And do you share this belief?" Clara asked, scarcely breathing. Edmund turned to face her, his features half illuminated by passing street lamps. "I once thought I did. Now I am less certain." The simple admission hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was prepared to fully articulate. Clara felt a curious tightness in her chest, not fear, but something more complex and tender. "I believe," she said carefully, "that duty performed without humanity becomes merely obligation, and obligation without compassion is a cold companion indeed." Edmund's gaze held hers, searching. "You speak as one who has given the matter considerable thought." "Perhaps I have," Clara acknowledged. "My own father, for all his faults, never lacked passion, though his affections were often self-serving. I have sometimes wondered which is preferable, too much feeling, poorly directed, or too little, perfectly controlled." "And what conclusion have you drawn?" Clara hesitated, then answered with honesty she would not have dared mere weeks ago. That balance might be found between the two extremes, that duty and feeling need not be adversaries. Something shifted in Edmund's expression, a subtle softening around his eyes, a tension easing from the corner of his mouth. "A wise observation, Lady Ravenshade." The carriage slowed as it approached the imposing facade of Ravenshade House. Edmund reached across the narrow space between them, his gloved hand covering hers where it rested on the seat. "I find myself," he said quietly, "increasingly grateful for the wisdom of my wife." The simple touch, the gentle pressure of his fingers, communicated something words could not. A tentative bridge extended across the careful distance they had maintained. Clara turned her hand beneath his, allowing their palms to meet, a silent acknowledgement of connection. As the carriage came to a halt, Edmund withdrew, the moment passing like a cloud shadow over sunlit ground. Yet something had changed. Some boundary shifted, leaving Clara with a curious mixture of anticipation and uncertainty as they ascended the steps to Ravenshade House. The Duchess Dowager awaited them in the drawing room, elegant in dove-grey silk, despite the lateness of the hour. "Well," she inquired without preamble, "has the Duchess of Bedford deemed us worthy of continued social existence?" Edmund's mouth curved in a rare smile. "More than worthy, mother. Clara has secured us an elevated position in her esteem, and by extension, in the estimation of all who value the Duchess's opinion, which is everyone of consequence," the Duchess Dowager observed with satisfaction. "Well done, my dear. I confess I had my doubts when Edmund first presented you as his choice, but you have demonstrated unexpected resources." From the Duchess Dowager, this constituted effusive praise. Clara inclined her head in acknowledgement, too weary for verbal sparring. "Clara is fatigued, mother," Edmund intervened. "The interrogations of the ton, even when favorably inclined, are exhausting." "Of course." The Duchess rose with regal grace. "Rest well, both of you. Tomorrow brings Lady Hargrove's musical evening, which we shall conspicuously not attend. Our absence will be noted with far more interest than our presence might have commanded elsewhere." As she swept from the room, Edmund turned to Clara with a wry expression. "My mother has elevated social warfare to an art form." "She is formidable," Clara agreed. "I begin to understand from whom you inherited your strategic mind." "A dubious compliment," Edmund replied, though his tone held amusement rather than offence. "May I escort you to your chambers? You do indeed look weary." Clara accepted his arm, grateful for the solid strength it provided as they ascended the grand staircase. The events of the evening, the subtle victories, the delicate negotiations of social standing, had drained her more thoroughly than she had realized. At the door to her rooms, Edmund paused. "Sleep well, Clara," he said quietly. "You have done the Ravenshade name great credit this night." "Thank you," she replied, oddly moved by the simple sincerity of his praise. "For your confidence in me. For everything." Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth, a hesitation, a decision contemplated but not yet made. "Good night," he said finally, lifting her hand to brush his lips across her knuckles in a gesture that had become familiar, yet retained its power to quicken her pulse. As Clara prepared for bed, her mind replayed the evening's events, the Duchess of Bedford's unexpected alliance, Edmund's quiet support, the moment of connection in the darkened carriage. Beyond the social triumph, beyond the rehabilitation of their standing, something more profound was taking shape between them, something that transcended duty or arrangement or convenience. She extinguished her candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the house settling for the night. Outside her window, London's muted glow illuminated the edges of the heavy curtains, a reminder of the world beyond these walls, with all its judgments and expectations. Yet here, in the sanctuary of Ravenshade House, Clara found herself less concerned with society's opinion than with the gradual unfurling of understanding between herself and the man to whom fate had bound her. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but something with the potential to bloom into more than mere coexistence. A beginning rather than an end. The letter arrived on the morning of their planned departure for Ravenshade Abbey, an innocuous cream envelope bearing Clara's father's distinctive scrawl. She recognized it immediately as Jenkins presented it on the silver salver, her heart performing an uncomfortable leap within her chest. "Shall I open it now?" she asked Edmund, who sat across the breakfast table reviewing correspondence of his own. He glanced up, his gaze sharpening as he registered the source of her discomfort. "That is entirely your decision, Clara, though perhaps privacy might be preferable given recent communications." The Duchess Dowager, engrossed in the morning paper, lifted her head with the alertness of a predator scenting blood. "Is that from Whitmore? After weeks of silence, he chooses the day of your departure to make contact. How predictably inconvenient." Clara tucked the unopened letter into her pocket, unwilling to provide further fodder for her mother-in-law's caustic observations. "I shall read it upstairs while my trunks are being finalized," she said, rising from the table. "Excuse me." In the sanctuary of her chambers, Clara broke the plain wax seal with trembling fingers. The single page contained barely a dozen lines, yet she found herself reading them thrice to fully comprehend their import. "My dearest Clara, circumstances compel me to humble myself, a task to which I am ill-suited by nature or inclination. The papers regarding Whitmore Park have been signed, not without reservation, but with recognition of necessity. Your mother's health continues to decline. a situation exacerbated by recent events for which I bear responsibility. I write not to seek additional assistance, but to offer what meager apology my pride permits. My behavior at the Merryweather affair was inexcusable. The shame I brought upon you cannot be undone, only acknowledged with profound regret. Should you find it within yourself to permit a reconciliation, your mother would be greatly comforted by your presence, however brief. Your father. Clara sank onto the edge of her bed, the letter limp in her hand. After weeks of silence, after public humiliation and private pain, these few stilted sentences represented the closest her father had ever come to genuine contrition. Not a full admission of fault, certainly not a comprehensive apology, but perhaps all that his battered pride could manage. A soft knock at the door roused her from contemplation. "Enter," she called, hastily folding the letter and returning it to her pocket. Edmund appeared, already dressed for travel in a charcoal frock coat and pearl grey waistcoat. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, remaining in the doorway rather than advancing into her private domain. "I merely wished to confirm you were, well?" The concern in his voice, understated but genuine, touched her unexpectedly. "My father has signed the papers," she said simply, and expressed regret for his behavior at the Merryweathers. Edmund's expression revealed nothing beyond polite interest. "I see, that is encouraging. He mentions my mother's health," Clara continued, watching him carefully, "and suggests a visit might be welcome should I be so inclined." A flicker of something, concern, wariness, crossed Edmund's features before his customary reserve reasserted itself. "Do you wish to delay our departure for Ravenshade Abbey?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications beyond its simple phrasing. Their planned journey represented more than mere relocation. It was to be their first real solitude together, away from the Duchess Dowager's watchful presence and London's gossip-hungry society. A chance to continue the gradual warming between them without constant scrutiny. "No," Clara said after a moment's reflection. "I have no desire to delay our departure, but perhaps we might stop briefly at Whitmore House on our way. It would require only a small detour." Edmund studied her face, his grey eyes perceptive beneath straight dark brows. "If that is your wish, of course we shall do so." "You would accompany me?" The question escaped before Clara could consider its implications. The revelation of her uncertainty, her reluctance to face her father alone, something softened in Edmund's gaze. "Did you imagine I would send you unaccompanied? Of course I shall attend you, Clara, if you desire my presence." "I do," she admitted quietly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then it is settled. I shall inform Jenkins to adjust our route accordingly." As he turned to leave, Clara found herself adding impulsively, "Edmund?" He paused, glancing back with a raised eyebrow. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your understanding in this matter, for—" She hesitated, uncertain how to articulate the gradual shift that had occurred between them, from strangers bound by contract to something approaching partnership. "No thanks are necessary between husband and wife," he replied, echoing words he had spoken before. Yet this time, they seemed to carry a different weight, not merely a formulaic reassurance, but a genuine acknowledgement of their evolving connection. 2 hours later, their carriage rolled to a stop before the modest facade of Whitmore House. Clara gazed through the window at the home of her childhood, noting with a pang how diminished it appeared compared to her memories. The garden untended, the steps in need of repair, the curtains faded by sun and time. "We need not linger if it proves too difficult," Edmund said quietly, observing her reaction. "A brief exchange of courtesies would satisfy propriety." Clara drew a steadying breath. "No, I wish to see my mother properly, to assure myself of her condition." They were admitted by a single aging footman, whose livery showed signs of careful but inadequate mending. The entrance hall, once modestly elegant, now struck Clara as threadbare. The carpets worn, the wallpaper faded, the gilt frames of family portraits tarnished with neglect. "Lady Ravenshade and His Grace the Duke," the footman announced as they were shown into the drawing-room. Clara's mother rose shakily from her chair by the fire, her once pretty face now drawn and pale, her figure diminished by worry and illness. "Clara, my dearest girl," she whispered, extending trembling hands. Clara crossed to her immediately, clasping the fragile fingers in her own and pressing a kiss to her mother's papery cheek. "Mamma," she murmured, "how I have missed you." Over her mother's shoulder, Clara glimpsed her father standing awkwardly by the mantelpiece, his once imposing figure somehow shrunken, his complexion flushed with what might have been embarrassment or lingering defiance. Edmund acknowledged him with a correct bow. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his tone neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore. We are en route to Ravenshade Abbey, but wish to pay our respects before leaving London." "How very considerate," Clara's mother replied, her voice quavering slightly. "Please, won't you be seated? I shall ring for tea." "We cannot stay long, I fear," Edmund demurred. "The journey is substantial and we hope to reach the abbey before nightfall." An awkward silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the long case clock in the corner, a handsome piece that Clara was surprised had not been sold to satisfy creditors. Her father cleared his throat, visibly struggling with words that did not come easily to his proud nature. "I trust you received my letter," he said finally, addressing Clara while studiously avoiding Edmund's gaze. "Yes, father." Clara maintained her place beside her mother, drawing strength from the familiar lavender scent that had always signified safety in her childhood. "I was glad of it." Charles Whitmore's eyes darted to Edmund, then back to his daughter. "The papers have been signed, as I mentioned. Your husband's terms were exacting but not unreasonable given the circumstances." Edmund inclined his head slightly, but offered no comment, apparently content to allow Clara to direct the interaction as she saw fit. She felt a surge of gratitude for his restraint. "I am relieved to hear it," Clara replied carefully. "Whitmore Park has been in our family for generations. I could not bear to think of it passing to strangers." "Nor could I," her father admitted gruffly, "though the means of its preservation are not what I might have wished." Mrs. Whitmore laid a thin hand on Clara's arm. "What your father means to say, my dear, is that we are grateful for His Grace's intervention, however difficult it may be to accept assistance." "Precisely so, my dear," Charles agreed, with a flash of the charm that had once made him the toast of country society. "Pride is a luxury the Whitmores can no longer afford, a lesson I have been slow to learn, to my family's detriment." The admission, however obliquely phrased, clearly cost him considerable effort. Clara felt a complicated mixture of emotions: pity for his diminishment, lingering hurt from his public betrayal, relief at this tentative olive branch. "Perhaps," Edmund suggested, breaking his silence, "the Whitmores might consider visiting Ravenshade Abbey later in the summer. The air would be beneficial for Mrs. Whitmore's health, and Clara would undoubtedly appreciate her mother's company as she acquaints herself with the estate." Clara turned to him in surprise, touched by this unexpected gesture of reconciliation. Her mother's face brightened visibly at the prospect. "How very kind," she breathed. "Charles, would that not be delightful?" Mr. Whitmore appeared momentarily disconcerted by this extension of ducal hospitality. "Most generous," he managed finally, "though I would not wish to impose." "Nonsense," Edmund replied smoothly. "Family connections should be maintained, particularly as we contemplate the possibility of expanding the Ravenshade lineage in due course." The implication hung in the air like delicate crystal, a reference to future children that brought a flush to Clara's cheeks and a speculative gleam to her mother's tired eyes. "How wonderful," Mrs. Whitmore murmured, squeezing Clara's hand. "Such joyful prospects to anticipate." The visit concluded shortly thereafter, with promises of correspondence and summer plans tentatively established. As they returned to the waiting carriage, Clara felt lighter than she had in weeks, not because all wounds had been healed or all grievances resolved, but because the first fragile bridges had been extended across the chasm her father's behavior had created. "Thank you," she said quietly, as Edmund handed her into the carriage, "for suggesting their visit. That was unexpected but deeply appreciated." Edmund settled opposite her, his expression thoughtful. "Your mother's health concerns me. The country air would indeed benefit her, and your happiness is important to me." The simple declaration, delivered without flourish or sentiment, nonetheless caused Clara's heart to beat a fraction faster. "You are more generous than my father deserves." "Perhaps," Edmund acknowledged, "but my generosity is extended for your sake, not his." There is a distinction. As the carriage rolled away from Whitmore House toward the open countryside beyond London's smoky confines, Clara felt a curious sense of chapters closing and opening simultaneously. Her parents would remain part of her life, not excised despite her father's transgressions, but her primary allegiance had shifted, her future aligned with the man seated across from her. The man who, despite the coldness of their beginning, had demonstrated more consideration for her feelings than her own father ever had. "Edmund," she ventured as London's outskirts gave way to greener vistas, "when you mentioned expanding the Ravenshade lineage, was that merely conversation or a faint colour touched his cheekbones?" The first time Clara had seen him display such visible discomfiture. "I apologize if the reference was premature," he said carefully. "I merely wish to suggest to your parents that our marriage, despite its arranged nature, might yet fulfill all the traditional expectations." "I see." Clara smoothed her skirts, uncertain how to proceed, but unwilling to let the moment pass unexplored. "And is that your wish? That our marriage should progress in the conventional manner?" Edmund regarded her steadily, his grey eyes more expressive than she had ever seen them. "My wish, Clara, is that our marriage might evolve naturally from arrangement to choice, that what began as duty might in time transform into something we both desire rather than merely endure." The simple honesty of his words, devoid of flowery sentiment yet profoundly meaningful, touched Clara more deeply than elaborate declarations might have done. She felt the last defensive walls around her heart begin to crumble. "I should like that very much," she replied softly. Something warmed in Edmund's gaze, a spark kindling in those usually guarded depths. He reached across the space between them, his hand extending palm upward in silent invitation. Clara placed her fingers in his, the simple contact conveying more than words could express. They remained thus connected, as the carriage rolled through the verdant English countryside, each lost in private contemplation, yet linked by that single point of contact. Outside, spring was transforming the landscape, tender green buds unfurling, wildflowers dotting the meadows with splashes of color, nature awakening from winter's dormancy to embrace renewal. Within the carriage, something equally profound was blossoming, fragile yet resilient, unexpected yet increasingly precious. Not the grand passion of poetry or the convenient affection of arrangement, but something more genuine, a partnership founded on growing respect, tentative understanding, and the first tender shoots of what might, with proper nurturing, flourish into love. As they journeyed toward Ravenshade Abbey and the next chapter of their shared story, Clara felt, for the first time since her wedding day, not resignation, but anticipation. The hand holding hers belonged to a man she was beginning to know, and perhaps more significantly, beginning to trust. The future, which had once loomed before her as a sentence to be endured, now shimmered with possibilities as yet unwritten. Ravenshade Abbey rose from the Somerset countryside like a vision from another time, grey stone walls softened by centuries of weather, soaring Gothic windows reflecting the late afternoon sunlight, formal gardens stretching toward the distant hills in geometric perfection. Clara gazed through the carriage window, momentarily breathless at the sight of her new domain. "It's beautiful," she whispered, unable to contain her awe. Edmund, who had been watching her reaction rather than the familiar landscape, allowed himself a small smile. "I am pleased you think so. The Abbey has been the heart of Ravenshade lands since Henry VIII gifted it to my ancestor after the dissolution of the monasteries." "Nearly 300 years of history," Clara murmured. "How intimidating." "Or inspiring," Edmund countered gently. "Each generation has left its mark, while preserving what came before. The West Wing dates from Queen Anne's reign, the formal gardens from my grandfather's time. Even the newest addition, the conservatory my mother commissioned, is now 20 years old." The carriage wound its way up the elm-lined drive, eventually passing beneath a stone archway to enter a courtyard where a double row of servants stood waiting to receive their master and new mistress. Clara felt a flutter of nervous anticipation as the vehicle came to a halt. "They have been preparing for your arrival with great enthusiasm," Edmund remarked, observing her apprehension. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, was particularly determined that everything should be perfect for your first impression. As if summoned by his words, a dignified woman of late middle age stepped forward as Edmund handed Clara down from the carriage. Her curtsy was deep and respectful, her expression one of barely contained excitement. "Your Grace, Lady Ravenshade," she greeted them. "Welcome to Ravenshade Abbey. The staff is honored by your presence." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," Edmund replied warmly. "I trust the journey was not too exhausting for you, Lady Ravenshade." Clara found herself smiling at the formality of the exchange, this public interaction between husband and wife that bore so little resemblance to their private conversations of recent days. Not at all. The scenery was most diverting. "Mrs. Winters beamed with proprietary pride. "Somerset has no equal for natural beauty, Your Grace, though I may be somewhat partial. If I might show you to your chambers. Tea awaits in the Duchess's sitting room whenever you wish to refresh yourselves." Clara glanced at Edmund, uncertain of protocol. In London, her rooms had been separate from his, connected by a door that had remained firmly closed throughout their marriage. What arrangements had been made here? "The Duchess's suite has been prepared as you instructed, Your Grace," Mrs. Winters continued, addressing Edmund with a significant look that Clara could not interpret. "The blue silk hangings were installed last week and fresh flowers have been arranged throughout." "Excellent," Edmund nodded. "Lady Ravenshade will undoubtedly wish to rest before dinner. The journey has been long, though not unpleasant." The housekeeper led them through the great hall, a soaring space with hammer-beam ceiling and ancestral portraits lining the walls, and up a grand staircase to the family wing. Clara tried to absorb the details as they passed, the quality of the tapestries, the gleam of ancient oak panels, the subtle fragrance of beeswax and lavender that permeated the air. "Here we are, Your Grace," Mrs. Winters announced, opening double doors to reveal a suite of rooms decorated in shades of cream and celestial blue. "The Duchess's chambers, His Grace's rooms connect through there," she added, indicating a door on the far wall, "and your lady's maid has been installed in the adjoining dressing room." Clara stepped into the sitting room, momentarily speechless. The chamber was exquisite, proportioned with mathematical precision, furnished with elegant restraint, the windows framing views of the formal gardens that stretched toward a distant lake. Subtle feminine touches softened the grandeur, embroidered cushions, delicate porcelain figurines, a writing desk positioned to capture the morning light. "This is," she began, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "My grandmother's preferred chambers," Edmund supplied, coming to stand beside her. "And my mother's during the years of her marriage. Traditionally, they belonged to the Duchess of Ravenshade." The significance of this was not lost on Clara. In London, she had been installed in guest quarters, a temporary arrangement befitting her uncertain status. Here, Edmund had placed her firmly in the role she had yet to fully embrace, Mistress of Ravenshade, his wife in truth as well as name. "They're perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." Mrs. Winters, observing this exchange with evident approval, cleared her throat discreetly. "I shall send your maid up directly, Your Grace. The staff will be presented formally before dinner, if that is convenient." "Most appropriate," Edmund agreed. "We shall dine at 8. Until then, Lady Ravenshade should not be disturbed except at her request." As the housekeeper withdrew, Clara found herself alone with Edmund in what was to be her private domain. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken awareness of their isolation from London's scrutiny, of the connecting door that represented both boundary and possibility, of the subtle shift in their relationship that had occurred during their journey. "I hope the chambers meet with your approval," Edmund said after a moment, his tone more personal now that they were unobserved. "If you prefer different colors or furnishings, alterations can be arranged." "No," Clara replied honestly. "Everything is beautiful, more than I could have imagined." Edmund moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens now gilded by the setting sun. "Ravenshade Abbey has always been more home to me than the London house," he admitted. "There is a permanence here that the city lacks, a connection to those who came before and those who will follow." Clara joined him, standing close enough to feel the warmth of his presence without quite touching. It must be comforting, that sense of belonging, of knowing exactly where and how you fit into the grand scheme of things. "It can also be constricting," Edmund observed, surprising her with his candor, "to feel the weight of centuries of expectation, of tradition that must be honored regardless of personal inclination." He glanced down at her, his expression softening, but perhaps less so when the burden is shared. The implication hung in the air between them, delicate as spun glass. Clara felt her heart quicken at the vulnerability in his usually composed features. "I should like that," she said quietly, "to share the weight as well as the privilege." Edmund's hand found hers, his fingers warm against her skin. "Then we are in agreement, Lady Ravenshade." The formal address, spoken in such intimate tones, brought a smile to Clara's lips. "I believe we are, Your Grace." For a moment, they stood thus, hands joined, framed in the golden light of sunset. Then a discreet knock announced the arrival of Clara's maid, and the spell was broken. "I shall leave you to rest," Edmund said, releasing her hand with reluctance that matched her own. "Until dinner, Clara." As the door closed behind him, Clara touched her fingers to her cheek, surprised to find it warm with colour. The journey from London to Somerset had traversed more than mere physical distance. It had carried them across the uncertain terrain between arrangement and affection, between duty and desire. And for the first time since their wedding day, Clara found herself looking toward the future not with resignation, but with hope. The morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the windows of Clara's sitting room where breakfast awaited on a small table beside the open French doors. Beyond, the formal gardens of Ravenshade Abbey stretched in manicured splendor, the air fragrant with early summer roses. 3 months had passed since their arrival in Somerset, a span of time that had transformed Clara's understanding of marriage, of Edmund, and perhaps most significantly of herself. The woman who had once trembled at the prospect of her wedding night now moved through the ancestral halls of Ravenshade with quiet confidence, her initial trepidation replaced by growing assurance. "Good morning, Your Grace," her maid greeted her cheerfully. "His Grace asked me to inform you that he has ridden out to inspect the north pastures, but will return by noon. He suggested you might enjoy visiting the rose garden, as the first blooms of the season have opened." Clara smiled at this thoughtful message. "Thank you, Mary. I believe I shall do exactly that once I've reviewed the menus with Mrs. Winters." Such domestic details had become part of Clara's daily routine, the gentle rhythm of country life, providing structure, without the rigid formality that had characterized their London existence. Here, away from society's watchful gaze and the Duchess Dowager's critical eye, she and Edmund had gradually established a relationship of their own definition, one built on mutual respect, shared interests, and a deepening affection that required no audience to validate its worth. After breakfast, Clara made her way to the housekeeper's domain, where the day's meals were discussed and approved with comfortable familiarity. Mrs. Winters had proven a valuable ally in Clara's assumption of her duties as mistress of Ravenshade, offering guidance without presumption, experience without interference. "The strawberries from the kitchen garden are particularly fine this year, Your Grace," the housekeeper observed as they concluded their consultation. "Perhaps a summer pudding for tomorrow's dinner? His Grace has always been partial to them." "An excellent suggestion," Clara agreed, touched by this evidence of the staff's devotion to Edmund's preferences. "And perhaps we might invite the vicar and his wife? The renovation plans for the village school should be discussed before the harvest preparations begin." Mrs. Winters nodded approvingly. "Very thoughtful, Your Grace. I shall see to the arrangements." As Clara made her way toward the rose garden, she paused in the portrait gallery, where generations of Ravenshades gazed from gilded frames with aristocratic solemnity. Edmund's father, the previous duke, dominated the central position, a stern-faced man whose grey eyes held none of the warmth his sons sometimes revealed. Beside him hung the portrait of Edmund's mother, her expression one of composed dignity rather than happiness. A space awaited Clara's own portrait, a commission scheduled for the autumn when a fashionable London artist would journey to Somerset. She had once dreaded the prospect of being immortalized as the Duchess of Ravenshade, fearful that the canvas would capture only her discomfort and uncertainty. Now the thought brought a quiet satisfaction. She had earned her place on these ancestral walls, not merely through marriage, but through the diligent assumption of the responsibilities that accompanied her title. The rose garden welcomed her with a profusion of color and fragrance, the early summer blooms opening to the morning sun in shades of crimson, blush, and ivory. Clara followed the gravel path to a stone bench positioned to capture both the beauty of the flowers and the more distant vista of rolling hills and ancient woodlands. Here she often came to read, or simply to contemplate the unexpected turns her life had taken. The sound of approaching footsteps roused her from contemplation. She turned to find Edmund crossing the lawn toward her, his tall figure outlined against the green backdrop, his riding clothes exchanged for more casual country attire. "You've returned earlier than expected," she observed as he joined her on the bench. "The inspection proved less time-consuming than anticipated," he replied. "And the day was too fine to spend entirely on estate business." The easy exchange, devoid of formality or strain, reflected the comfortable companionship that had developed between them during their months at Ravenshade Abbey. Here, away from London's rigid social hierarchies, Edmund had gradually revealed aspects of himself rarely displayed in society: a dry wit, a thoughtful intelligence, a capacity for genuine enjoyment of simple pleasures. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, his gaze directed toward the distant hills, "about your parents' visit next month." Clara nodded, appreciating his careful approach to what remained a somewhat delicate subject. Her father's letters had grown more frequent and less defensive in recent weeks, suggesting a gradual healing of the breach his behavior had created. "I believe it will be a positive experience," she said. "Mother's health has improved considerably since spring, and father seems humbled by recent events." "Indeed." Edmund's expression remained thoughtful. "I've received correspondence from my solicitor regarding Whitmore Park. The repairs have been completed, and the tenants report increased yields from the improved drainage system." Clara felt a surge of gratitude for his continued attention to her family's estate, attention that extended beyond mere financial oversight to genuine improvement. "Thank you for overseeing those matters. I know father would never have undertaken such modernizations himself." "It was the sensible course of action," Edmund replied, modest as always in accepting her thanks. "A properly maintained estate benefits everyone connected to it." He hesitated, then added more softly, "just as a properly tended marriage yields rewards beyond initial expectation." The observation, spoken with such quiet sincerity, caused Clara's heart to beat a fraction faster. Edmund was not given to romantic declarations or effusive sentiments, his affection expressed through actions rather than words, through consideration rather than poetry. Yet in this moment, she felt the full weight of what remained unspoken between them. "Edmund," she began, uncertain how to bridge the final distance that separated arrangement from acknowledgement, duty from desire. He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes warmer than she had ever seen them. "Clara," he replied, her name on his lips a complete sentence in itself. "I find myself contemplating how fortunate I am in my choice of Duchess." "Even though I was selected from a list prepared by your mother?" she asked, a smile softening the question. "Especially so," he admitted, reaching for her hand with a gesture that had become familiar, yet retained its power to affect her. For once in her life, the Duchess Dowager's manipulations yielded results superior to her intentions. Clara laughed softly at this gentle mockery of his formidable mother, her fingers curling naturally around his. She would be most affronted to hear it phrased thus, "which is precisely why I reserve such observations for your ears alone." His thumb traced a gentle pattern across her knuckles, the simple touch conveying an intimacy that had grown between them with the passing months. "There are many things, Clara, that I find myself sharing only with you. Thoughts I would once have kept private, considerations I would previously have shouldered alone." "As do I," she acknowledged, thinking of her own transformation from the fearful bride who had entered Ravenshade House to the woman who now sat beside him, confident in her place both in his home and in his regard. Edmund's free hand reached to touch her cheek, the contact brief but meaningful. "When we were wed," he said quietly, "I promised to honor and protect you, though our arrangement was one of convenience rather than choice. I find, however, that my feelings have progressed considerably beyond the bounds of mere duty." The admission, so carefully phrased yet so profound in its implications, caused Clara's breath to catch. "As have mine," she whispered, the truth of it resonating through her very being. For a moment they remained thus, connected by touch and gaze, the unspoken finally finding form in the warm summer air. Then Edmund leaned forward, closing the distance between them with deliberate intent. His lips touched hers with exquisite gentleness, a first kiss that asked permission rather than claiming right. Clara responded with equal tenderness, her hand rising to rest against his chest, where she could feel the steady cadence of his heart. When they drew apart, the world seemed transformed, the colors of the garden more vibrant, the scent of roses more intoxicating, the future stretching before them rich with possibilities neither could have imagined on their wedding day. "I believe," Edmund said softly, his forehead resting against hers, "that we have progressed beyond formality indeed." Clara smiled, her eyes meeting his without reservation or fear. "Perhaps we should inform the Duchess Dowager that her arrangement has evolved in ways she never anticipated." "Perhaps we should," he agreed, the rare warmth of his smile transforming his austere features, "though I suspect she would merely claim credit for the outcome, however unexpected." Their shared laughter rose into the summer air, a sound of genuine joy that echoed across the gardens of Ravenshade Abbey. And as Edmund drew her close once more, Clara reflected that the quiet terror of their beginning had yielded to something infinitely more precious, a love born not of passion or convenience, but of understanding, respect, and the courage to reach across the silence toward genuine connection. The hand that had once trembled in fear now rested securely in his, steady and certain of its welcome. In the stillness of our deepest fears lies the seed of our greatest transformations. Lady Clara's journey reminds us that what begins as duty can blossom into devotion, that arranged circumstances need not determine our ultimate happiness. The walls we build to protect ourselves often become the very barriers that prevent us from experiencing life's most profound connections. The Duke's evolution teaches us that true strength lies not in maintaining distance, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to extend a hand across the chasm of uncertainty and touch another soul with genuine compassion. In that single gesture of holding a trembling hand, he demonstrates that power finds its noblest expression not in dominance, but in gentle protection. Perhaps the most poignant lesson is that love rarely arrives in the packaging we expect. It doesn't always announce itself with thunderous passion or immediate recognition. Sometimes it grows quietly, in the spaces between words, in small considerations, in the gradual building of trust, when fear gives way to understanding. Their story whispers to us that the most enduring bonds are forged not in perfect circumstances, but in our willingness to see beyond initial impressions, to recognize the humanity in another, and to choose connection even when convention or pride would have us remain apart. In the end, the trembling hand that finds stillness in another's grasp becomes a powerful metaphor for life itself, for how we might all find peace, not in isolation, but in the brave decision to reach out and be truly seen. Would you like more Victorian romance stories? If you enjoyed The Wedding Night Was a Quiet Terror Until the Duke Held the Hand, She Tried to Keep from Trembling, Please subscribe to our channel for more beautifully crafted Victorian romances that capture the delicate dance of duty and desire, propriety and passion. Leave a comment below sharing your favorite moment from Clara and Edmund's journey. Was it the confrontation at the Merryweathers' ball, the quiet transformation at Ravensshade Abbey, or perhaps that first tender moment when the Duke noticed her trembling hand and chose compassion over convention? Your engagement helps us create more immersive historical romances that transport you to a world of grand estates, complex social hierarchies, and love that blooms despite, or perhaps because of, the constraints of its time. Subscribe now and join us for our next enchanting tale coming soon. Thank you for being part of this journey.